The Civil Rights Movement was a major part of American history. In 1868, the 14th Amendment abolished slavery. But that did not stop the racial discrimination against African Americans. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 prohibited racial discrimination in public places. But this did not last long. People in schools, restaurants, movie theaters, and even water fountains were separated by race. Supreme Court ruling, Plessy v. Ferguson, came to the conclusion that separate but equal was constitutional. In 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, was founded. They worked to abolish racial inequality through law. African Americans weren't the only ones fighting for their rights during this time. In 1929, Mexican Americans were fighting discrimination after the Mexican-American War. They came together and formed the League of United Latin American Citizens, or LULAC, and protested abuse and racial inequality and helped educate Chicanos. Along with those, there were more than 100 statutes limiting the rights of Japanese Americans. Thus, they formed the Japanese American Citizens League, or JACL. In 1941, the NAACP and A. Philip Randolph began organizing a march on Washington in protest against discrimination and hiring in the federal government. Pressure from the NAACP and Randolph caused President Roosevelt to issue an executive order banning discrimination or hiring for federal government positions. Plans for the march were called off. In 1948, Harry Truman signed the Executive Order 9981, establishing the President's Committee on Equality and Opportunities in the Armed Forces, along with the Brown versus Board of Education. Came the opposing side. The whites began a council against desegregation and voted in a governor that wanted to sustain white supremacy. The first law for civil rights, not aimed towards African Americans, was for Hispanics. In Hernandez versus Texas, discrimination against Hispanics was outlawed. One of the most darkest moments in the civil rights movement occurred in 1955 when a young boy named Emmett Till was kidnapped and brutally murdered and beat. After allegedly whistling at a white woman, two men came into his house and took him away near a river, where his body was later found. In the case involving the murder, an all-white jury concluded that the two men convicted were innocent. The civil rights movement evolved majorly in 1955. A young seamstress, Rosa Parks, sat on a bus and refused to give up her seat to a white passenger. She was later arrested. This sparked the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott. Led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., African Americans refused to ride the bus and instead carpooled and walked to their destinations. This protest lasted a whole 13 months after it began. In 1957, the Southern Christian Leadership Committee, or SCLC, is established by Martin Luther King Jr. and David Abernathy. They encouraged African Americans to vote and protest with sit-ins. Whites still denied blacks entrance into schools even after Brown versus Board of Education. Finally, with the help of the federal troops, to hold back mobs, non-African American students attended a public high school in Little Rock, Alabama. This became known as Little Rock Nine. Sit-ins weren't very popular until 1960, when 4 African American college students participated in a sit-in at an all-white lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. When asked to leave, they remained in their seats. This sparked many sit-ins throughout the South. Also during 1960 was the creation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. In 1961, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, established Freedom Riders with blacks and whites. The riders would ride the buses into the South, and when the officials wanted to separate them, they would refuse. James Meredith was the first African American to attend the University of Mississippi. Protected by the Army the entire time, Meredith was able to graduate from the university. In 1963, the secretary of the NAACP, Medgar Evers, was murdered on his way home in Jackson. The man convicted of murdering him was tried 3 times with an all-white jury each time. Perhaps one of the most famous speeches in history was "I Have a Dream." Dr. Martin Luther King stood at the Lincoln Memorial and spoke to a large crowd. Shortly after the speech, 4 girls are killed in an explosion of a church in Alabama. In 1964, the Mississippi Council of Federated Organizations and CORE helped register many African Americans to vote during a period known as Freedom Summer. During this time, 3 civil rights workers, 2 white and 1 black, go missing. Their bodies are later found in Mississippi. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed. It banned discrimination in workforce, and employers had to provide an equal opportunity for employment regardless of race. On March of 1965, African Americans who went to vote were interrupted when police began to club and tear gas the marches. This Black Day in history became known as Bloody Sunday. African Americans could finally vote safely and be protected by the law after the Civil Rights Act of 1965 was established for voting purposes. This prohibited laws that discriminated against someone's right to vote on the basis of race. During 1967, women made a difference by starting the National Organization for Women, or NOW. The organization fought for better quality education, employment, and political opportunities for women. Perhaps a day that will be remembered always is April 4th, 1968, a day after giving his "I've Been to the Mountaintop" speech. Dr. Martin Luther King was shot and killed at Tennessee's hotel. The citizens of America living in the worst conditions were not African Americans. Native Americans were the smallest minority group but faced the biggest problems. The unemployment rate from Native Americans were 10 times the national rate. Thus the American Indian movement formed. As civil rights is still being fought today, the movement has helped shape America and will keep us all as one.